Good morning. It's Friday, June 5th, and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberaj, a managing director at Savills, a leading tenant advisory commercial real estate firm. And we are at the end of week 12 of social distancing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The first of several memorials for George Floyd, who was killed in police custody, was held in Minneapolis yesterday. And the mayor of D.C. and the president of the United States are at odds over who has control of the streets of Washington as protests continue. Today's topic is fighting hate from home, and I'm honored to be joined by Jonathan Greenblatt, the president of the Anti-Defamation League. Good to see you, Jonathan.
Nice to see you, Ken.
Well, when we planned this, about a month ago, I don't think we could have foresaw how the conversation would evolve from such a pressing topic of rising hate during COVID in general and anti-Semitism to now dealing with the very timely concerns about racial injustice out there in the protests that we've seen. Why don't you take us real quick over what the last 12 weeks have been like for you and your team on the front lines?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Thank you much for the opportunity to be here. I'm excited to spend a little time talking about the issues. I think the last 12 weeks isn't like anything I have previously experienced, and I would go so far as to say it's not like anything that anyone really living right now in this country has experienced. I mean, I think you've had three different trends that have all collided. The first trend, of course, is COVID-19, global pandemic. And yes, there have been, instances of disease at scale before. We had the Spanish flu in 1918, right? Polio, which is a persistent and pervasive problem in this country in the first half of the 20th century. But I don't think we've ever had a global phenomenon that moved so far, so fast. We didn't have a globalized economy previously or a globalized society. And so the death toll and the morbidity and the economic consequences, are just staggering. I know for my organization, we've been kind of in a rhythm because of this, working from home like everyone else. Sure. But I'll tell you, we forecast a 25 to 30% decline in revenue. Just because of having to cancel travel, pull down events, pull back on everything. So we're already trying to cope with that. And again, the health impacts and the economic consequences. That then flows into the police brutality that was, on display last week in Minneapolis, which, let's be honest, George Floyd wasn't the first. From Taylor to Ahmaud Arbery, to Trayvon, to Eric Garner, to so many others. Quite frankly, for far too long, Black Americans have experienced not just injustice at the hands of police, but, suffered at the hands of a racist and unjust system. I think we recognize the extraordinary fatigue and despair and outrage that Black and brown communities are feeling, and the moral imperative for us as white Americans to be standing with and in support of these communities and in opposition to the oppressive racism that they face. When you are not in active opposition to the racism, you are complicit in it. So I know we've got work to do to try to address the systemic injustices, like again, in our kind of our law enforcement policies, but also to make sure that the environments that we foster at ADL, we've got to do to make as inclusive as we can be, and to make sure the process of doing the work, right, because it is as important as the work itself. So number one vector is COVID-19, global pandemic. Second vector is sort of systemic racism. And then the third vector, I would say, is no longer creeping. It's galloping authoritarianism. The militarization of our streets is something with literally no precedent. You go back to the Civil War in the 1860s to remember a time when U.S. troops marched in formation on our streets. And I would dare say that even then, you didn't have what you have now, which is this frightening display of force perpetrated by the president, again, without the alignment of governors and mayors. I think it's really scary. And I can tell you, communities of color, faith groups like minorities, like the Jewish people, know that authoritarianism and chaos is bad. We benefit from, I don't know, rule of law. We benefit from a degree of kind of constitutional rights and order. So this unraveling of the democratic norms, this degradation, if you will, is profoundly scary. And I think is the third leg in this very frightening stool that is the moment that we're living in today.
And one of the things that's obviously creeping up that overlays all of that is kind of the explosive growth of social media and the ability for misinformation to really get out there. And I think last year we saw that you recorded the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents since you've ever tracked it. Yeah. How was your data looking, obviously, this year? I mean, obviously, over the last couple of weeks, I think we've seen an explosive increase worldwide in anti-Semitism associated with COVID.
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. So ADL's been, we describe ourselves as the oldest anti-hate organization in the world. Mm-hmm. We're one of the longest standing civil rights groups in the United States. We were founded in 1913. Mm-hmm. And we've been tracking hate for generations. Mm-hmm. And we've been auditing anti-Semitic incidents for 40 years. So what I mean by that is every year we do an audit that we substantiate with information compiled through direct reports from victims, law enforcement agencies, community leaders, media reports. Every incident that we track is the result of my staff, and I have 360 staff people around the country, 5 offices, verifying everything we report. So someone may, we may hear from a community leader, or from a police officer, or from a victim, or through the media. And then we go out and we validate everything. And I would also say that we track not just hate crimes. So hate crimes are misdemeanors or felonies, like an act of vandalism or violence committed against an institution or an individual because of an immutable characteristic, like their faith or their national origin or their gender or their race, etc. We do track that, and we also track what I call bias incidents. Okay. So this would be bullying at a school, or getting harassed on the street, or getting stalked online, which might not rise the attention of crime, might not get law enforcement's attention, but it gets our attention.
Good.
I just lay all that out, Ken, because I want to contextualize the work. So we've been doing it for 4 years. Everything is double checked. Mm-hmm. I've got very sound data, and the data doesn't lie. In 2019, and then put it in another piece of perspective, Ken. So anti-Semitic incidents in this country had been declining since 2001. 2001 because of 9/11 and crazy conspiracies that the Mossad or the Jews knocked down the Empire State Building, which obviously is not true. There was a high, and then they went down and down and down and down and down. And then things changed in 2016, when that number increased year over year, 34%. It spiked. All attributable, all, by the way, weighted to the second half of the year, Ken. Mm-hmm. Very causal, if you will, to the presidential campaign.
Yep.
So the insertion of anti-Semitic memes and anti-Semitic tropes, and like white supremacists showing up at like campaign events, like exaggerating, those things fed an environment where hate crimes really went up, generally in specific issues. 34% increase in 2016. In 2017, that number spiked 57%. That was the single largest surge we had ever tracked year over year. And it was the highest total in our history.
Wow.
Went 34%, 57%. In 2018, the number dipped 5%. But actually, the acts of violence more than doubled year over year. And of course, 2018 was Pittsburgh. 2019, I had thought, sort of silly me, that the number would go down. Like, how could it not? And in fact, in 2019, the number increased 12%, and we had the highest total that we've ever tracked in 40 years. There were 7% more acts of harassment, I think 16% or 19% more acts of vandalism and 50% more acts of violence. And if we try to get calls and say, well, what is this? Definitely the charged political environment's part of it.
Yeah.
Definitely, a president who's, at best he's vulgar, right? At worst, he's degraded the whole public conversation. And the scapegoating and the name calling doesn't help. And the extremists feel emboldened, all these things. But I will tell you, social media has allowed this to spread like nothing else. We're all sheltering in place to avoid spreading COVID-19, while social media is literally a petri dish for prejudice. It's allowed it to not just spread, but to metastasize and mutate in ways. And so as we've looked at COVID-19, I don't yet have the numbers for this year.
Sure.
COVID-19, we've seen horrible things, from innovations like Zoom bombing, forms of harassment online, to conspiracies that George Soros is responsible for COVID-19, or that, George Soros or the Jews. I've seen lots of stuff, Ken, that the Jews are singularly spreading the disease, or that the Jewish state developed the disease as a bioweapon.
Which has a long history, right? This isn't the first time where a disease or a pandemic or issue has emerged where there has been conspiracy theories, misinformation, that it came from Jews, that it came from immigrants, that it comes from minority communities. And now, to your point, with the spread of social media, it just seems like you must be on defense nonstop.
Entirely. I think it's literally, it has grown. These claims and conspiracies have grown exponentially. And I mean that in the arithmetic form, not in like an exaggerated, this is a way to describe it because it's literal, like it's rhetorical. No, like literally it's grown 10x, 20x, 100x. Now, I'll tell you, to your point, in the 1930s, they kept Jews out of this country who were trying to flee Nazi Germany and Europe that was crumbling, because they could be criminals among them, fascist spies, or they had diseases. And then in the 40s, after the war, when there were Jewish refugees, displaced persons who wanted to come to America, they said, we can't let them in because there could be criminals among them. They could be communist spies. That was how things changed. And to your point, Ken, they probably have diseases. This idea that somehow immigrants or Jews specifically traffic and carry diseases, it's an old myth. It's like an old wine now in the new bottle of COVID-19.
So Vice President Biden had a virtual town hall yesterday, and he said something that I think is relevant to our conversation. He said, I thought we had made enormous progress when we elected an African-American president, but hate only hides. And if you breathe any oxygen into that hate, it comes alive again. So that seems to directly align with the numbers that you've seen since 2016 in terms of growth. How much of is this expansion of authoritarianism and language and kind of a lack of aggressive pushback and accountability against white supremacism, especially after Charlottesville? How is that all just fanning the flames and kind of giving even more oxygen to make this a day-to-day reality where you are seeing more Confederate flags, you are seeing Nazis in the streets? This isn't something in the shadows anymore. The oxygen has really just amplified this hate.
Yeah, it's truly stunning. To be quite frank, at ADL, we have something called the Center on Extremism. And I have some of the best analysts in the world who are experts, and they have PhDs in extremism, and they study right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism and white supremacy and, Islamist radicalism and all this stuff. And so we're watching the white supremacists, not just reading what they post on Facebook, although we do that, but we're in the private chat rooms and we're in their discussion groups and whatnot. So we know what they're saying to each other, not just the public. And I can tell you, we know the extremists feel emboldened, Ken, because that's what they're saying. We've watched them weaponize these platforms. And because of the product design, because of the libertarianism of some of the management of these companies that host these services, it's allowed the worst elements in society to kind of literally like spores spread around and grow like weeds. Now, what's really germane here is that indeed we need our leaders to lead. And consciously or unconsciously, the country follows literally, the country follows their lead. And so when the president says there's good people on both sides, that has an impact. And when the country says, or when the president says, you know, let's, or when his people say, let's dominate the battle space, that has an impact.
Yeah.
Look, Jews in particular are sensitive to this because the instruments of the state have been used against Jews for over 1,000 years to try to convert or to persecute or to murder them. And typically Jews' experiences in exile led to them, again, either choosing to flee or to face terrible penalties. And so we're sensitive to it. I think it's a Jewish community. I think if you look at Black Americans' experience for hundreds of years of systemic and like unending marginalization, sometimes institutionalized in the law, sometimes in culture, there are awful parallels. If we ever want to turn this around, I mean, the election of Barack Obama was a milestone and a watershed, but it was but one moment. And we've got, you know, I used to work with President Obama, as you know, Ken, and he used to love to quote that famous saying, the moral arc of history bends towards justice. But I think what I've learned in 5 years as the CEO of ADL is that's not quite right.
Yeah.
Moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, but you got to reach up and grab it, and you got to twist it toward a better tomorrow. Because if you don't, if you just let it go on its own, like that's not, we can't, there's no foregone conclusion here unless we force it to happen.
No, and if we don't hold it and pull it to the ground, it'll just slingshot backwards, which has obviously been the case since 2016. Thinking about how to get on offense, you're doing a tremendous amount, but there's also a lot kind of happening in general. You know, when I was at an ADL gala, that's the first time I really learned about Integrity First for America and their effort to actually sue Nazis post-Charlottesville. And right now I'm in Northern Virginia, so right now in Virginia, obviously the governor has just called for the removal of Lee's statue in Richmond. How do you think these specific kind of things where you go directly at the hate, directly at these symbols of injustice, how important is that?
I think it's critical. Look, symbols signal what we value as a society. So when you ride on the Robert E. Lee Highway in Northern Virginia, that is a signal, if you will. That is a symbol, if you will. That suggests that there was something there to memorialize. You know, when you have Confederate flags or statues of Confederate generals at the state capitol, that is a signal, right? That is a symbol of what we value. And look, if I were a Jewish person and I found myself walking through Berlin and there were statues of Nazi generals, right? And there were statues, or I drove on, you know, part of a road or a street that was named after a Nazi general who, by the way, may have paved that street, right? Who may have built that section of town, but nonetheless also was responsible for the systemic extermination of 6 million people. That would leave me feeling a certain way. So we should not be surprised when Black Americans see Confederate generals and other symbols of the Confederacy enshrined and lifted up. When they feel like that's sending them a signal, that's because it is. So I applaud what Governor Northam is doing. Like I applauded what, you know, the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, did himself.
Mitch Landrieu, yep.
Like I think, and you know, frankly, Governor Haley did it in South Carolina before he went on to be part of the Trump administration. He took down the Confederate flag. I think symbols tell us what we value. And so taking down those symbols is an important step. Now, by the way, I just will say that in and of itself is not enough to right the wrong, but it's an important step on a journey to create a more inclusive society. Yeah.
So let's take a step back to one of the prongs that you were talking about earlier, the blatant military response to the protest industry, right? So compare that to the response of COVID, right? There was a real intentional effort, it appeared, from the federal government to kind of leave it to the states, let them organize, get their own PPE, handle how they would address the spread of a pandemic that was impacting all of us globally, nationally, across state lines. And then as the protests emerged, there was a swift response to put boots on the ground to really push back. How do you gauge the response of the federal government to two different issues that are going on?
Look, it's astonishing. I don't think there's anything partisan or political about observing what you just did.
Yeah.
Like, it is hard for me to fathom how the government, our federal government, was unable to muster an organized, effective, distributed response to something of such consequence. And there seemed to be denials and obfuscation. And it was very mixed signals and confusing. And it was like a Darwinian experiment of sorts. And then yet here, the president wants to dominate the battle space.
Yeah.
Federal troops to clear Lafayette Park. I used to work in the White House, man. I spent many lunches in Lafayette Park. Like, the idea that you'd have the U.S. military clearing it. And there were many demonstrators there. By the way, just so we're clear, there was one person, and I would walk down that Pennsylvania Avenue all the time, like every single day for 3.5 years. And I remember there was one awful demonstrator, or awful is the wrong word, but there was a demonstrator there, and she had these awful signs that said things like Israel is a cancer and Israel is satanic and all these, and she had other anti-Semitic things that were disgusting. But I never thought to myself, oh, the answer is let's have the U.S. military forcibly remove this person. Like, that's not how it works. Dissent is part of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Saying hard things, angry things, is the price we pay for living in a democracy that affords us so many rights and so much privilege.
Mm-hmm.
So I find it, to be charitable, it's puzzling that the response of the president has been so militarized.
Mm-hmm.
I say this, Ken, to be clear. I don't condone violence, looting. I know people firsthand, friends of who had their stores looted and their business damaged. In Los Angeles, where I lived for many years, my old office was damaged. My friends' businesses were looted. Like, this hits close to home for me. And yet, the idea that the response to it, I mean, you do realize, or we should point out the fact that while there has been violence which deserves to be, stopped and interrupted immediately, that is a tiny fraction of the hundreds of thousands of people who engage in peaceful protest. And if anyone has any doubt on that, you should just know, if it were truly the case that hundreds of thousands of people were all in some violent insurrection, there would be, millions of cases of assault and even worse. There have been only a fraction because it's actually been a small thing. You might not know that if you listen to certain people in authority or watch certain cable news channels. But we've got to keep, if you will, our eye on the prize.
Yes.
The question is, how do we come out of this in a way that makes sure that America is inclusive, provides economic opportunity for everyone. And that's where I hope this will end up.
So let's piggyback on that, because, with all these conversations, we're talking about very challenging issues. And this one, the timing of our conversation today, just is incredibly difficult. What kind of silver lining do you hope or imagine to emerge from this? So part of this is like, what we have to deal with this. These are real issues. Your numbers are probably going to spike more dramatically than you can even imagine in 2020, right? So, how do we absorb this? How do we move forward? And what can we take away? What can be the silver lining that we move forward from this moment and actually reflect back and say, okay, you know what? This was a very difficult year, but this is what we learned and how we grew from it.
I think it's a great question. I guess there are probably a couple things. I mean, so number one.
And if you don't have a silver lining, I mean, that's fair, but that would be, we gotta stay focused on how we get out of this.
I mean, I would be, let's say, hopeful that number one, we will see real reform in policing practices. Now, to be clear, the ADL works very closely with law enforcement. We've been doing it for decades. We train them. We're the largest trainer of law enforcement in the country on extremism and hate. But the number of incoming I've had in the past week from law enforcement agencies who want to get trained now on implicit bias. Now, what happened to George Floyd was nothing implicit about it. It wasn't bias. It was explicit violence. Let's be clear. But I think there may be a real effort at policing reform, which would be good, number one. I think number two, I think a lot of, frankly, white Americans like me and like you who live with a kind of privilege and a kind of unconscious immunity because of our skin color are being woken up to what people like, Brian Stevenson and Michelle Alexander and Ta-Nehisi Coates and many others have said for years.
Yeah.
But the fact that more people are developing a consciousness about this, that can be a silver lining too. And then number three, I hope that there are some new coalitions built. I think, or existing coalitions reinvigorated to really create the change we need. I will say to you, one of the things that we will need as a country, and I don't really care if you're Republican or Democrat, left, right, we need everybody engaged in our political process, Ken.
Yeah.
It's more attention to people participating in the democratic process, voting. If there's more people, engaging, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
We need to listen to the voices that often aren't heard, whether they are Black or Jewish or anything else. And that makes all of us, we can come together, I think, and create that we want, that we inherited, and that we owe it to our children to improve and leave to them. I see a country that's better than the one that we found when we got here.
Well, Jonathan, I know you and your team are working all day, all night, not missing a beat. I want to thank you for coming on today and chatting with us. And anything that folks can do, ADL.org, we want to make sure we're all doing our part and getting out there.
I tell you, I think, people go to ADL.org. I'll also just say that there are so many great organizations doing this work: the NAACP, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Urban League, Color of Change, Equal Justice Initiative, the Center for Policing Equity, Robin Hood. I am so proud that these are some of our partners and friends, and I would encourage people not to go to ADL.org, but to check out these other organizations as well. Yeah,
we had Westmore on a couple of weeks ago, and we're going to continue doing that work. We had David Clooney from Black Economic Alliance. We're going to keep raising these issues and continue to try to make these conversations something that provide a platform and an opportunity to discuss these difficult things. So I want to thank you for coming on. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. Our next conversation is going to be next Thursday, June 11th. Our topic will be educating America's workforce in a post-COVID-19 world. And we'll obviously continue to dive into the issues affecting college students going back and anti-Semitism and everything else that needs to be addressed as we continue these conversations. Jonathan, thank you. And everyone have a good weekend and stay safe.
Please be well.